Hello, this is Melanie Moon, and I'm reading Chapter 7 of Race in the City, edited by Henry Louis Taylor Jr. Race and the City: Work, Community, and Protest in Cincinnati, 1820 to 1970. I strongly recommend that you purchase this book. It's on Amazon. You can get it so that you can look at the charts. I am downloading the charts, also information about the contributors. I'm just thrilled. I tried to find Henry Louis Taylor Jr. on Facebook, and I found him. And he accepted my friend request. So I just sent a message to him. I'm very sure that it's him. He is now a professor in Buffalo, New York, I believe. And he's doing great work, I can tell from the things that he has posted on his Facebook page. So I'm just so excited to have gotten in touch with him. And he must have been 15 when he wrote this book, because he looks very, very young, considering the fact that it was written in 1993. So I will let you know as things progress there. I'm hoping to hear from him, and I'll share with you what he says. So, Chapter 7 is written by Robert B. Fairbanks, and I'm trying to find all of the contributors on Facebook. Not been very successful, but I found the main one. The title is Cincinnati Blacks and the Irony of Low-Income Housing Reform, 1900 to 1950. Cincinnati blacks suffered from inadequate housing long before the so-called Negro housing crisis, quote unquote, appeared during and after World War I. In fact, a recent study of mid-19th century Cincinnati concluded that local blacks, quote, occupied the worst land and housing, unquote, in the city, footnote. And although by the turn of the century Cincinnati had greatly expanded in population and size from its walking city days, the plight of the Queen City's blacks had improved but little. Observing housing conditions in the streetcar city during 1913, the city health officer, J.H. Landis, lamented, quote, "In Cincinnati, it is almost impossible for a colored man to secure decent quarters for his family," unquote. These conditions bothered the officer, who felt that blacks, quote, are respectable, law-abiding, and industrious, but because of race prejudice are compelled to live in the slum district, unquote, footnote. Cincinnati blacks face discrimination in other areas too. Most of the city's hotels, restaurants, and saloons barred blacks, while theater managers seated them in segregated quarters. Enterprising blacks experienced equally humiliating conditions in their quest for vocational or professional training. Neither the city's medical schools nor its Ohio Mechanics Institute admitted them. Most local unions also closed their doors to blacks. As a result, they remained on the bottom rung of the city's economic ladder. Racism worked against local blacks in many ways and created what the historian Thomas Philpott has called a quote-unquote color line that limited both economic and residential mobility. Even the efforts of white tenement reformers at the turn of the century often adversely affected blacks. By 1900, many of the city's middle and upper-class citizens had abandoned their old homes in the Basin, a 4-square-mile area that had composed the old walking city, to poor urban newcomers interested in locating near the expanding industrial and commercial sections of the city, where work opportunities abounded. The large slums that resulted from this remarkable population turnover frightened many who felt who left and spurred them to promote quote unquote reform organizations concerned with ordering and regulating what they perceived as the chaos of the slums. Tenement reform emerged as one of the most important movements to come out of this anxiety about the slums. Local civic, philanthropic, religious, and health organizations joined together to promote a new tenement code out of fear that poorly built and maintained tenements encouraged bad morale, poor health, and improper morals. After a long struggle, in May 1909, the city strengthened its tenement regulations in part of a broader, as part of a broader building code. Enforcement of those regulations negatively affected blacks in several ways. It depleted the city's already limited housing stock by eliminating the city's worst housing, but doing little to promote new housing. Since blacks lived in the city's most dilapidated tenements, their housing came under the most careful scrutiny of tenement regulators, who often ordered expensive repairs, sometimes passed on to the tenants in higher rents, and occasionally vacated irredeemable dwellings. Tenement regulation also discouraged the construction of inexpensive tenement houses, thus further limiting black housing opportunities in the basin. According to the Cincinnati Real Estate Board in 1917, quote, very few tenement houses had been erected in the basin of the city, unquote, after the new tenement code because it had, quote, increased the cost of building and maintenance of this property to such an extent that the rent received from such property does not pay a fair return on the investment, unquote. Although tenement regulation proved the most important legacy of progressive era tenement reform, some effort was directed at building quote-unquote model tenements for the poor. Yet such undertakings were handicapped by what Philpott has called the quote-unquote business creed of housing developers. The tenets of that creed were simple. Quote, housing was a commodity for private enterprise to provide at a profit. I believe they have the same code today. And if model tenements were to succeed, they would have to return a profit of not less than 5% to their investors. Completely philanthropic endeavors never seem to have been considered by Cincinnati reformers, since they viewed such housing as detrimental to both the marketplace and the tenant. Tenement reform in Cincinnati prior to 1915, then, was clearly limited by the color line and the business creed. But it also was shaped by a definition of housing problems that focused on the dangers posed by deteriorated, congested, and unsanitary buildings. Jacob G. Schmidlapp's early efforts at model housing reflected this preoccupation with the dwelling place. Schmidlapp, a wealthy Cincinnati businessman and philanthropist, became interested in the city's housing problem, particularly its black housing problem. While serving as a trustee for the McCall Colored Industrial School, Schmidlapp decided to experiment with model housing after discovering the appalling conditions in which many of the school's students lived between 1911 and 1914. He constructed 96 units of housing for both whites and blacks, and located them all outside the congested basin. Schmidlapp erected simple and affordable working-class housing with the hope that other capitalists would follow his example. His first venture, 2 family houses with separate entrances and a backyard, contained individual baths, indoor toilets, and gas heat. Despite his concern for needy blacks, however, Schmidlapp only built 12 of the first 56 units he completed for them. The color line and the business creed had clearly limited his efforts. His Chapel Hill project, located in a black neighborhood in Walnut Hills, provided 4 3-family dwellings. These prison-like tenements, quote unquote, on the southeast corner of Park Avenue and Chapel Street contained a wash tub and other conveniences not usually found in black housing. Schmidlapp built another project for blacks on Fredonia and Whittier streets. But angry neighborhood whites in the racially mixed area forced him to exclude blacks from the completed dwellings. Schmidlapp's concern with inadequate black housing led him in 1914 to form the Model Homes Company. He convinced other prominent Cincinnatians to join in his housing effort and raise $500,000. With that money, the Model Homes Company developed a large-scale housing project for blacks on Syracuse Avenue in Walnut Hills, located outside the city's congested basin area. Like other Schmidlapp ventures, this 188-unit project was expected to provide a 5% return to its investors. Unlike earlier Schmidlapp housing ventures, however, Washington Terrace focused on the neighborhood rather than merely the dwelling place. Developed along a quote-unquote community plan, the project would provide a wholesome neighborhood environment, producing not only physical and moral betterment, but also civic improvement. This massive reconstruction of the tenants' physical and social world would free them from the dangers of social disorganization, physical disease, and neighborhood deterioration, all characteristics of the slum. Furthermore, in their new setting, blacks would be able to learn the middle-class values of hard work and participatory democracy. Indeed, Schmidlapp's concern with making better citizens led him to require tenants to join community clubs that would be, quote unquote, responsible for caring for the place and for the conduct of its members. To encourage group activities, Schmidlapp built a 200-seat assembly hall, which residents could use for religious, educational, and civic meetings. Around the buildings, Schmidlapp enhanced the landscape and designed playgrounds to create a quote-unquote cheerful surrounding. The Washington Terrace project then differed from earlier Cincinnati housing reform efforts. It defined housing not simply as dwelling space, but as a package of amenities such as play space, neighborliness, and shared commercial conveniences that created some type of neighborhood, quote-unquote, culture. This new approach to housing, emphasizing neighborhood community rather than individual dwelling units, would dominate Cincinnati housing reform efforts until the 1950s. Although blacks were the first to benefit from this new definition of the housing problem in Cincinnati, they ultimately would suffer under the new orientation of the reformers. Cincinnati, like many other northern cities, experienced unprecedented black migration during World War I. Rural Southern blacks flooded into the city after 1915, lured by the Queen City's economic opportunities stimulated by a war-induced boom economy. By 1920, the city's black population had increased nearly 2.5 times what it what its size had been in 1890. Many of the black newcomers crowded into 3 wards of the once aristocratic West End and found accommodations in mansions now divided up into small tenement apartments. Between 1910 and 1920, the black population in that section of the old walking city almost doubled, rising from 8,647 to 17,209. Blacks were particularly concentrated in the lower West End near the Ohio River. The combination of virtually no new building during the war and increased black and white migration to the city resulted in extreme congestion in basin neighborhoods. That congestion, in turn, attracted greedy speculators who bought West End tenements, raised rents, and then sold them for artificially high prices. Oh my gosh, that sounds just like gentrification, just like what we're experiencing in our community. Blacks suffered the consequences. As Yvette Carnell would say, we eat the failure. Between 1918 and 1922, rents tripled for some buildings. These high costs, as well as the very real shortage of dwelling units for blacks, promoted some extraordinarily congested buildings. In 1923, the Better Housing League found a 3-room flat at 1131 Hopkins Street that somehow accommodated 20 blacks. It also discovered a 12-room tenement house on George Street that housed 94 blacks. In response to the housing shortage, many West End families took in relatives or friends. Others, attempting to supplement their meager incomes, rented rooms to strangers. A survey conducted during the post-war housing crunch found that 740 black families in those 3 wards took in at least 1 lodger. More than 160 black families housed 3 or 4 lodgers nightly. I'd like to read that again, but I would encourage you to just rewind and read that again. The combination of high congestion, poor sanitation, and improper maintenance of these old dwellings yielded severe health problems. Black mortality rates were double that of Cincinnati as a whole. Conditions deteriorated to such a low that when the noted public health official Dr. Haven Emerson visited Cincinnati's West End in 1923, he told the city's Public Health Federation, quote, "You could not produce a prize hog to show at a fair under conditions that you allow Negroes to live in this city. Pigs and chickens would die in them for lack of light, cleanliness, and air." Unquote. Footnote. Local reformers readily acknowledged the severity of the black housing problem in the West End, and when conditions failed to improve, even after the post-World War I housing crunch for whites had ceased, they created a special committee on Negro housing. That committee developed several strategies for combating the black housing problem. First, it focused on education and regulation, hoping to teach the rural black migrants good housekeeping practices, and the special committee recommended that the Better Housing League increase its staff of visiting housekeepers from 6 to 15. That just enrages me. They think that the problem is with the tenants when it's the tenements that are dilapidated, they don't get the wages that they need to live in the homes by themselves. They have to take in lodgers and renters, overcrowding their own homes just to pay the rent, which has tripled. And they say they need more staff, and none of whom are black, I'm sure. They need more staff to pay them to go in and tell the African American tenants how to live in those conditions. That's like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. Forgive me, but yeah, I'm a little pissed off. Okay. The realtors persuaded the Better Housing League to create a program to teach urban newcomers the principles of better housekeeping, because they thought that ignorant black tenants comprised the root of the city's housing problem. Now the special committee recommended that the community chest increase its financial allotment to the Better Housing League to pay their white staff, so it could employ more of its friendly visitors. Quote, footnote. The committee also requested that the city hire more housing inspectors and encouraged investors to make additional deposits in building and loan association accounts to provide much needed capital for building homes. In addition, the Special Housing Committee sponsored a contest and offered a $500 prize for the best house that could be constructed for less than $5,500. Finally, it asked local capitalists to invest an additional $500,000 in the Cincinnati Model Homes Company so that organization could build more new housing. None of these strategies were carried out. Oh, I'm surprised. None of these strategies were carried out, however. Even the housing contest failed to elicit appropriate entries. Footnote. The inability to raise new capital for the Model Homes Company particularly distressed the housing reformers, who firmly believed that, quote, the present situation, unquote, could not be, quote, relieved materially without the construction of more homes, unquote. Although the Model Homes Company had erected 402 dwelling units between 1914 and 1919, including 213 low-cost housing units for blacks. 213. It remained particularly dormant after World War I. The combination of Schmidt-Lapp's death in April 1919 and the highly inflated housing costs after the war limited the company's activity. Inflation particularly inhabited the company's building program. A flat constructed in 1915 for $1,400 could not be duplicated in 1925 for anything less than $3,750. I'm kind of faltering here, I'm sorry, but that year, 1919, my grandparents were married in 1919. My mother was born in 1923. I don't know the year that my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, arrived in Cincinnati, but I know that they lived in the West End. I remember visiting when I was a little girl with my dad, his parents, in the West End. I'll have to check that to be really, really sure with my aunt. But this just sort of helps put this into context, the conditions under which my grandparents were living at that time. So that's why after I read 1919, my grandparents had just married. My maternal grandparents had just married in 1919. When the company finally constructed an experimental 3-unit building in 1923, the consequences of high building costs became very evident. Rents for a 4-room flat in Washington Terrace went for $11 a month in 1915. 8 years later, a 4-room flat in the new building rented for $35, a price much too expensive for all but a few of the city's blacks. I wonder why. As a result, company officials decided that any new housing it built at this time would be erected for whites, since most blacks could not afford the high rents brought on by inflated construction costs. Building for whites might still benefit blacks, according to model homes officials, by drawing whites out of the basin and opening up more opportunities there for blacks. Trickle down, yeah, we get the leftovers. About the same time, the Model Homes Company initiated a program that it hoped would more directly help blacks. In 1926, the company acquired a tenement on Carr Street in the Lower West End, remodeled it, and rented it to blacks. According to its 1927 annual report, this 10-unit dwelling proved only a quote-unquote limited success. Indeed, the Carr Street unit was the company's only black unit with excessive vacancies. The explanation for this was simple. According to company officials, blacks wanting and willing to afford model homes accommodations simply did, quote, not want to live in the West End bottoms, unquote. The ambitious poor wanted out of the basin slum and would not be satisfied with just a better dwelling. They wanted better neighborhoods. The rising cost of the 1920s so adversely affected those blacks lucky enough to live in model homes, other projects. Let me read that again. The rising costs of the 1920s also adversely affected those blacks lucky enough to live in model homes, other projects. The Model Homes Company raised rents 25% in 1924 because maintenance costs continued to increase, and the company remained committed to the business creed of housing. The decision of the local tax appraiser in 1926 to more than double the assessment of Model Homes Company properties also affected rents for the buildings. I wonder if it's going to say more about that. The discriminatory practice of increasing the effective property tax rate in black communities, where blacks paid more for property tax. And of course, they were probably renting. So it was the landlord who ate that increase in property taxes, and he put that burden on his renters, which were African American. Okay, so I'm interested to see if they give me more on that. So I'll continue reading here. The Special Committee on Negro Housing and the Model Homes Company were not the only participants involved in housing betterment during the 1920s. That decade witnessed a variety of activities concerned in part with improving the city's housing. Over the next 20 years, Cincinnati would gain national renown for its commitment to better housing through effective planning and housing leadership. The Cincinnatians Alfred Bettman and Ladislas Segoe gained national prominence in the planning profession, while Better Housing League's head, Bleecker Marquette, became a respected figure in national housing circles. All three adopted the Washington Terrace approach to Cincinnati's housing needs by defining the problem as inappropriate neighborhood community rather than merely inadequate shelter. As a result, they abandoned the notion that good housing could exist in the congested basin and focused on promoting good housing outside that area. Regulation remained a part of this new housing movement, but it too reflected the new goals of the neighborhood betterment. Tenement codes were supplemented by comprehensive zoning and master planning as a way to protect and encourage the development of better neighborhoods for the entire city. Unlike the reform emphasis at the turn of the century, which attempted to eradicate the worst kind of housing conditions and only regulated slum dwellings, the 1920s movement promoted citywide housing guidelines to protect Cincinnati from future slums. For instance, the city's master plan of 1925, and I have downloaded that plan, drawn up largely through the efforts of Bertman and Segoe, provided a model of a good subdivision layout and identified the elements that made up good neighborhood community. The new town of Marymount, developed on the eastern outskirts of Cincinnati by Mary Emery, provided the city's greatest monument to the neighborhood community emphasis in the 1920s. This development combined neighborhood communities with commercial and recreational opportunities in an attempt to create in its residents a sense of identity and involvement in community affairs. High housing costs and discriminatory practices, however, prevented blacks from experiencing the benefits of this model suburban town. And I dare say, as of right now, Marymount is still predominantly white. As the housing emphasis gradually changed from eliminating or improving deteriorating tenement dwellings to promoting good community housing, blacks benefited little. Not only did they fail to see any of this community housing be built for them in the 1920s, but the whole notion of community housing became equated with homogeneous neighborhoods, thus reinforcing the color line. The slum in the 1920s was defined not merely as dilapidated dwellings inhabited by poor people, but as an environment characterized by heterogeneity of peoples, shelters, and land uses. Such a setting lacked, quote, an established cultural pattern which would serve as a guide for the overt actions of the community, unquote. As a result, groups, individuals, and families in slums lost, quote, unquote, their identity and lived, quote, unquote, various social patterns. without, quote unquote, any purposeful objective. The response to this problem, and it's stated as such in the 1925 plan, which I've downloaded, the problem, in the 1920s was to push homogeneous neighborhood settings based on shared social, economic, and racial characteristics. Footnote. This concern with homogeneous neighborhood community, as well as the emphasis on providing good housing for the entire metropolitan area, helps explain why planning and housing activists reacted so negatively toward Black efforts to find better housing during the 1920s, when Blacks started moving into the predominantly white Mohawk-Brighton area of the basin due to the block-busting efforts of white realtors. The Better Housing League moved swiftly to stop this, quote, scattering in white neighborhoods, unquote. League officials instructed its visiting housing keepers to persuade house-hungry Blacks to avoid Mohawk-Brighton, fearing that such a movement would not only promote racial tension, but also facilitate the rapid deterioration of a neighborhood through race mixture. Footnote. Ambitious Blacks seeking to leave the social pathology of the West End faced similar disapproval from housing and planning activists when they started building cheap housing in unimproved subdivisions on the fringes of metropolitan Cincinnati, just north of suburban Lockland. Because this Black suburban housing violated the accepted norms of good neighborhood housing, as well as middle-class aesthetic standards, Better Housing League officials called this Black push for better housing, quote unquote, a momentous problem, and sought county zoning legislation to halt the future spread of these quote unquote suburban slums. Housing officials had enough power to thwart Black initiatives for additional housing, but they proved impotent to carry out their own plans for additional good Black housing. The Model Homes Company, for example, had accumulated sufficient capital during the 1920s to construct another large-scale project for Cincinnati's Black wage earners. Model Homes officials decided to develop a Washington Terrace type project for Blacks since building costs had leveled off by 1929, and Blacks continued to face serious housing shortages in the city. They purchased a site adjacent to an already established Black enclave in West College Hill in suburban Cincinnati, but threats and protests from nearby white communities forced the company to abandon its plans and sell the site. Footnote, the Model Homes Company stood ready to build a large-scale project for Blacks outside the basin even after the stock market crash, but it failed to find a vacant land site acceptable to Cincinnati whites. Footnote. Some new housing opportunities did occur for Blacks as a result of the Great Depression, however. The nation's economic collapse stimulated a local and national movement for federally supported slum clearance and low-income housing for urban America. Unlike the Model Homes Company, which had attempted to build close to the city's periphery, the Depression movement focused on the redevelopment of the urban core. Throughout the 1920s, local housing reformers had avoided such a strategy for two reasons. First, Since they defined good housing on a neighborhood scale, the high cost of land acquisition and slum removal seemed prohibitive for large-scale projects. Second, the reformers believed the city's core was destined for non-residential use as the city's commercial and industrial base expanded. By the end of 1929, however, they questioned these assumptions. Now it appeared that the process of quote-unquote natural growth had slowed to a halt, and the West End would remain a slum unless some quote-unquote outside help was forthcoming. This new view led Cincinnati groups such as the Better Housing League, which had earlier opposed federal intervention, now to support federal efforts for expensive slum clearance and public housing in the basin, because they prefer to keep them in the inner city than go to the peripheries or to the suburbs. Only then could the city's most disordered area be tamed and local residents persuaded to live there by the lure of decent housing. The Planning Commission, under the direction of Alfred Bettman and Myron Downs, conducted an intensive investigation of the basin's social, economic, and physical characteristics. Its findings led to a plan calling for the redevelopment of a 145-block area in the city's urban core. According to the plan, the hopeless slums, quote-unquote, in the North and West Central Basin area should be raised and redeveloped around neighborhood community settings arranged as 16, quote-unquote, super blocks. These settings would encourage a sense of neighborliness and provide plenty of open space and recreational opportunity. Super block development attempted to create the same type of setting for quote-unquote community development that both Washington Terrace and Marymount had promoted. Good housing under this formula meant good neighborhoods. And these planned settings would not only produce healthy tenants, but also help promote civic-minded citizens anxious to participate in the larger community. A significant omission appeared in the redevelopment plan, however. The city's worst slum area, the Lower West End, Census Tract 5, was not included. Reformers viewed this area, which contained the city's most dilapidated buildings, its worst criminals, and its sickest citizens, as irredeemable because of its complex land mix and the enormous poverty and quote-unquote hardened attitudes of its residents. It also happened to be 95% black. The city's redevelopment plan guided the local public housing program and helps explain why the city's neediest and blackest area received no housing projects. It does not totally explain, however, why the city's initial public housing program provided so little housing for the city's black population. When the all-white Cincinnati Metropolitan Housing Authority first submitted a proposal to the Public Works Administration Housing Division in 1933, it requested the redevelopment of 6 superblocks in the West End. 4 of those 6 blocks were in white areas and were scheduled for whites-only public housing. The CMHA also requested a suburban black project north of Cincinnati in an effort to clean up the suburban slum, areas that had bothered housing officials during the 1920s. Later in 1934, when officials resubmitted the application for basin slum clearance and public housing, the city secured permission to build approximately 1,400 units for white families and 600 units for blacks. Landowners from the racially mixed area scheduled for slum clearance and black public housing thwarted government plans when they refused to sell their land at what the PWA thought, what's that, Public Works Administration, thought a reasonable cost. This forced the PWA to purchase land in a nearby area undergoing racial change, but still considered part of the white West End. As a result, officials designated the city's first public housing venture, Laurel Homes, as a whites-only project. A large public uproar from the black community eventually pressured the CMHA into allocating part of that project to blacks on a segregated basis. But it opened less than 1/3 of the units for blacks. Several reasons appear to explain why the CMHA developed its unusual priority system, which gave the fewest housing units to the city's neediest people. First was the problem of rents. Slum clearance and redevelopment were costly. The neighborhood community plans for PWA public housing provided low-density housing on expensive central city land. Land acquisition and demolition costs, along with the project's design, which provided for open spaces, added greatly to developmental costs. And since rents provided a means of repaying loans made to cover much of these costs, they were relatively high for low-income residents. Although officials eventually modified the PWA program during the planning stages, the CMHA initially projected rent for Laurel Homes as high as $21 per month. Only 9% of the blacks living in the basin paid such rent, as compared to approximately 21% of the basin's whites. This might have influenced the CMHA in its decision to allocate twice as many units for whites. Another reason that the CMHA allocated more public housing to whites may have been tied to the concept of the quote-unquote deserving poor. Housing reformers believed that many tenants in the city's slums were deserving poor, either urban newcomers with no other place to live or residents temporarily down on their luck. One of the reformers' chief goals was to separate these deserving poor from the vicious or undeserving poor of the slums, because they believed that continued residency in the chaotic slum setting, along with long-term contact with those permanent slum dwellers, might adversely affect the deserving poor. Oh. By moving them into good citizen building communities, housing reformers hope to save or rehabilitate those just starting to show the effects of slum life. Public housing, then, provided more than mere shelter and was an effort at social engineering. Apparently, local reformers thought that more deserving whites lived in the basin than deserving blacks. Or possibly they may have felt that Cincinnati blacks had been exposed to the pathology of the basin slums longer and would therefore be harder to rehabilitate. Like mass incarceration of our black males? Yeah. Simply put, reformers may have thought it judicious to avoid the neediest tenants and concentrate on saving the clearly salvageable. Finally, the color line played a role in the CMHA's decision. The first slum site chosen was located in a section of the West End still considered white, and turned it over to blacks. And turning it over to blacks might have caused hard feelings and opposition among white basin dwellers. Oh, we mustn't do that, we mustn't do that. Indeed, the PWA Housing Division had developed a quote-unquote neighborhood composition rule, which stated that the public housing project should reflect the population characteristics of the area in which it was built. Since public housing was so new and controversial, local advocates did not want to do anything such as displacing whites for black housing. That might antagonize the public. You think? Congress passed the Housing Act of 1937 as the PWA constructed Laurel homes. Shortly after President Roosevelt signed the bill, the CMHA secured 3 public housing projects for Cincinnati from the newly created United States Housing Authority. Not only would the CMHA be permitted to develop a slum clearance project for blacks in the West End, but the United States Housing Authority, or the USHA, authorized it to erect 2 other projects on vacant land outside the basin, one for blacks and one for whites. The Lincoln Court Slum Project for blacks, planned for the area immediately south of Laurel Homes, sparked a new round of controversy. Many realtors and landowners in the lower West End, anxious to increase property values, thought that the city's next slum clearance project should be located there rather than in the less deteriorated Central West End area. They correctly argued that the lower West End was the city's worst slum. But because public housing focused on community and citizen rehabilitation rather than merely providing safe and sanitary shelter, the CMHA passed over the nearly all black and desperately poor area because of high land costs and the undesirability of many of its quote-unquote undeserving residents. High land costs imposed by the community development strategy nearly thwarted Lincoln Court's development. Work on the project stalled when land and building costs exceeded the USHA's limits. Meanwhile, white residents also halted the planned vacant land housing project for blacks. As a result, the first public housing project in Cincinnati built under the Housing Act of 1937 were the vacant land projects of Winton Terrace and English Woods, both admitted whites only. The CMHA's announcement of its intention to build its first 2 projects under the Housing Act of 1937 for whites only produced a storm of protests from both house-hungry blacks and unhappy white realtors. The former clearly felt betrayed and challenged the sincerity of the CMHA. The latter believed that public housing should only be built for the city's most deteriorated basin slum areas, where it might help depressed property values. Eventually, the USHA modified its requirements so Cincinnati could have its all-black West End public housing project. This action came none too soon because black housing continued to deteriorate and vacancies for blacks remained scarce. Indeed, by 1939, the amount of black housing available for occupancy was 1.3% of the total stock. Normal vacancy rates usually ran about 5%. In many ways, however, the redevelopment of the Lincoln Court site simply compounded the housing shortage. The clearance of the area dislocated 1,030 black families at a time when there were only 205 suitable vacancies in the city for blacks. When completed, it produced a net increase of 38 units. Many of those displaced by the project were ineligible for public housing because of inadequate income. More than 600 displaced families on relief were neither eligible for public housing nor able to find relocation housing easily. The CMHA eventually rehoused them by convincing tenement owners in racially mixed areas to turn out their white tenants and rent to blacks. That's the answer. Landlords agreed when they were reminded that they could charge higher rents to blacks. The city's neediest blacks were barred from Lincoln courts, as had been the case for Laurel Homes. Although many of the moral and social requirements that had been imposed on applicants for Laurel Homes had been dropped for Lincoln Court, the relatively high rents and minimum income requirement clearly limited who could live there. The wartime setting further complicated Lincoln Court's occupancy. The CMHA agreed to give black war workers first priority in moving into Lincoln Court in order to receive a needed allocation of building supplies for the War Production Board. Even black workers outside the basin were admitted to Lincoln Court before residents displaced by the slum project. Throughout the war, the CMHA allowed defense workers with incomes exceeding the maximum limits set by the USHA to remain in the project. Public housing during the 1930s and 1940s then did not address the problem of insufficient shelter for the city's neediest. Rather, it was built to reward the ambitious but moderately poor black family that wished to avoid the pathology of the slum but could not because of conditions beyond its control. Given the limited housing opportunities for this group of blacks, this was no small achievement. But the irony of the situation was nevertheless very real. Reformers who embraced the negative approach to housing betterment through tenement regulation at the turn of the century focused exclusively on the poor. This negative approach to housing betterment eliminated the city's worst housing, which unfortunately was the only kind many black Cincinnatians could afford. By the 1930s, however, when housing reform embraced a more positive approach to addressing the city's housing needs through the building and promotion of good neighborhoods, the city's neediest citizens, its poorest, blacks, were ignored. Even worse, slum clearance projects displaced many blacks, and CMHA officials barred them from living in the new public housing due to the minimum income requirements. Public housing policy changed again in the 1950s, this time opening up opportunities for the city's poorest blacks, although the government never built enough projects to meet their need. By this time, however, the enthusiastic and energetic leadership that had characterized the housing movement in the 1930s had waned. Housing professionals and management experts replaced committed reformers as the force behind public housing. Balanced ledgers and maintenance needs supplanted citizen-making as the main concern of these new quote-unquote housers. This limited vision, along with curtailed financial assistance from the federal government, eventually transformed the city's housing projects into its newest slums. In some ways, the policy of the 1950s and 1960s, it reads, resemble the much earlier strategy emphasizing elimination rather than construction, because the urban redevelopment and highway building projects of this era often destroyed the city's poorest neighborhoods. Little was done to guarantee that those displaced would find better neighborhoods. As a result, bulldozers razed the city's most dilapidated slum areas, worsening the housing shortage, which led to overcrowding and slum formation in other parts of the city, as the private real estate market proved totally incapable of providing good housing for needy blacks. And the new public housing policy abandoned ambitious blacks who had once benefited from community-oriented public housing projects to the whim of the racist private housing market. Such developments, unfortunately, had their payoff in 1967 when black rioting occurred in the city's new slum of Avondale. Cincinnati. It's time to make us whole.